Welcome to Post AGI. I'm your host Soubhik. This show starts with a simple premise. The AGI debate is the easy part. The harder questions are everything that comes after for capital, for governance, for labor, and for the world that we'll have to live in. Each episode of this show features a long form conversation with someone thinking hard about one of those questions. Let's get into it. Today, we are talking about labor growth and markets in a world shaped by AI. It's easy to tell a simple story. Jobs get automated, productivity rises, markets get smarter, and society get richer. But the closer you look, the messier it gets. Maybe AI changes jobs more than it replaces them. Maybe productivity gains show up in narrow use cases long before they spread across the broader economy. And maybe agents do not naturally form efficient markets at all, but instead need carefully designed rules and institutions to coordinate. To help us unpack all of that, we are joined by economist Alex Imas. Alex is the Roger L. and Rachel M. Goetz Professor of Behavioral Science, Economics, and Applied AI at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, Alex, let's start with the labor piece because this is where so much of the public conversation is happening right now. So, every day there is some job report coming up that AI is impacting this much job, that much job. So, a lot of people, when they talk about AI exposed job, it is as if exposure automatically means displacement, layoffs. What do you think most people are missing when they think about which jobs actually disappear versus which jobs actually change and might get shifted to a new type of jobs?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of layers here. So first of all, let's talk about what exposure actually means. A job is a bunch of tasks. So it's not like a job is just one type of thing that you're doing. So like typically with a job, if you're a software engineer, you're writing code, but you're writing multiple types of code for different sort of functionalities. You're also going to meetings, you're kind of coordinating with other teams, you're doing maybe some customer relations. All of these sorts of things are necessary for you to complete a job, right? So you need to do all of those things well in order to kind of say like, look, I'm doing a good job. What I just described is called the task-based model of jobs. So this David Autor and others have been kind of modeling this sort of thing since the early 2000s. Once you think about a job as multiple tasks, then you have to think about, okay, what does AI exposure mean? How AI exposure is defined, given kind of like the definition from the academic literature. The most famous one comes from this paper called GPTs or GPTs. GPTs is the one we're familiar with. GPTs, the second time, is for general purpose technology. General purpose technology is something that's been studied in economics for a long time. This is something like electricity, right? Electricity is a technology that you could use for your computer, for your TV, for, running the electric car. It's just used for a whole bunch of things. So there's a whole like subfield of economics thinking about what do general purpose technologies do, and GPT's AI is a type of general purpose technology. So in this paper, they basically said exposure is when AI can do basically 50% or more of a task in a job. So then when you look at the exposure score, like if you download like one of these platforms that calculates things for various jobs, they basically take a job, go to this thing called ONET. ONET is like a database of different tasks that each job is composed of, and say, all right, how many of these tasks can AI do 50% of or more? And then they say, okay, this job is very exposed because say like 50% of the tasks are done by AI to some extent versus something like manual labor or truck driver or something like that. At least now, very little of that job is exposed because AI can't really do much of that job. And so exposure has this sort of like, it's a loaded word. It welcomes the interpretation of displacement. But this is really unfortunate because it really doesn't mean that at all. Oh, because let's say you have a job, right? And let's say you have 50% of the job exposed. That means that the person can basically take AI, do 50% of my job, and then take all of the effort that they used to put in to that part of the job and just focus on the other 50%. meaning that the actual job that they have gets better. They're actually becoming more productive. If you
So
become more
here basically the efforts are getting focused into one. Say there are 8 tasks. Now you have 4 tasks. 4 got automated. You focus all your effort on these 4 tasks. And the
exactly,
idea is like
you become more productive. So maybe your wage actually increases, right? So this model that I'm describing is called the O-ring model of automation. It's by Avi Goldfarb and Joshua Gans. They have a really nice theoretical paper, basically arguing that look, in order to do a good job, you need to do all of your tasks well, right? What that means is that if AI, automates 4 out of 5 tasks, you still need a person in the loop. And if that one task is critical to get the job right and the person can now focus on that task, wages can actually increase rather than decrease. And you actually want more people doing that job versus less. When does it turn into more people versus less? That depends on a statistic called the elasticity of consumer demand. So what is the elasticity of consumer demand? It's a fancy term to mean that how much more of the product do people buy when the price goes down? Productivity goes up, prices in a competitive market will go down, right? If people don't buy more of the goods, so it's inelastic, it's not very elastic, that means that you could hire one person to do the job of, like, say, 4 people. People aren't absorbing, the consumers aren't absorbing the extra productivity, so you fire 3 people, right? But you can get a scenario with very elastic demand where, wow, something's become cheaper, people are buying more of it. Now you might be hiring more people to make the product, because you need to be making more of the product in order to be able to satisfy the increased demand that's out there in the economy.
it seems like then it means that it's like different products might have elastic demand, different other products might not have elastic demand. So all these job loss or job exposure job is dependent on the, like, what is the how many tasks you have in a job, how much is can be automated, and the demand of the product in which that job is being
Exactly.
done, right? It's some function of that.
There's other variables that are important. I don't want to say they're unimportant, but those are like the headline statistics. This is why the exposure measure is so misleading when you're thinking about displacement, because literally you can have the exact same level of exposure that could be quite high. And what you could end up seeing is more people are getting hired for that job versus less. And so if the market's very elastic, you get increased employment for a very exposed job. So, yeah.
But one thing here is that you mentioned that some jobs, like for example, coding skills, these are getting much more automated because people have data sets. They
Mhm.
have behavioral data, how coders work, and all this. Like Anthropic, they are able to make so much progress on coding skills because there is a lot of digital data. That might be the right way to say, to train these models. Training corpus is there. Now for say trucking or much more manual task where it might be a single dimensional
Yes.
job, single,
Mhm.
there is not enough data. So or in data sets, so for example, Amazon is hiring a lot more workers because they want to get that training corpus.
Yes.
So isn't it possible in the short range we might see, like for tasks which, for jobs which are just single tasks, we might see shoot like a positive growth rate in hiring, because the corporations want to hire more people to get the training corpus, and then they lay off, like the impact happens based on the theory that you just mentioned.
Yeah. So the other dimension is what I call the dimensionality of the job, which is the number of tasks. So a company is a lot more motivated to automate a job if it has fewer dimensions, because basically investing in automation means I could get rid of the entire. If you fully automate the job, you can just get rid of the entire labor sector in that job, right? And that saves a lot more money than, say, like I have a coder or something like that, and sure, I can make them more productive. I can automate like 3 or 4 of these tasks, but I still have to keep paying for labor. And so if I'm a company and I'm thinking about the investment decision into automation, I'm going to be less motivated to invest in automation if I can't just get rid of that person, right? But if it's a one-dimensional, two-dimensional job, I might hire more people temporarily. I might invest a lot in the technology in order to actually be able to automate that job, because I'll be able to save so much more money by putting all of that into technology and capital instead of labor. And so
That's
I personally, I'm much more worried about those jobs in the medium run than I
right.
am about these high dimensional jobs.
Right.
You know, in our this is the point of that of an article I wrote on my blog about what does AI actually mean for the automation of jobs. In there, I said like, look, if you get that dashboard of exposure, some of these jobs don't look very exposed. These like low dimensional jobs, but I'm worried about those because even though they're not exposed because that one or two tasks aren't yet automated, there's a lot of money being invested in getting that done. You just mentioned hiring people in order to collect the data, in order to automate them. And I just read an article in India, you know, a lot of the textile shops, they're getting people to wear cameras while they're doing that work. Why are they wearing cameras? Right? They're wearing cameras to get data on how people are doing the job. Right. So people are just collecting so much more data on these tasks, and so I'm very worried about physical tasks.
Yeah. So Alex, it seems like the framework that you bring here is super interesting. Where like when a job has fewer dimensions, which means fewer tasks, then the main value prop of AI in those sectors could be actually in cutting costs. Whereas in the higher dimensional jobs like coding that you just mentioned, what we are seeing is it's increased profit, it's increased revenue, it is increased growth, it's entering into market segments that I would simply not be able to operate in, right? Like, there's no way for like three engineers to build and compete against like a big company, before, AI productivity growth. So maybe that's where we see the stratification is like instead of job loss, you see productivity gain in segments where you have this high dimensionality and like you can actually make the existing people much more productive. Is that
Right. Yeah,
is
I mean,
that
it's hard to make somebody more productive if you're automating them.
right? Right, right. Yeah.
The company is going to become more productive in the sense that they're doing
Right.
less. So that's a very, very important distinction. And this is the difference between something, and you know, this is a lot of people are talking about this. This is the difference between augmentation and automation.
Right.
Augmentation is like the centaur or cyborg, whatever you want to call them, people working with AI. In low dimensional jobs, this could happen, right? You could have a world where, you know, you introduce AI into a low dimensional job and now it becomes a high dimensional job.
Right.
And now you still need the human for certain things, but they're way better at those certain things. And those certain things are different than what we know today.
Right. Right.
Well, I think that's definitely a possibility. But the other very salient possibility is just getting rid of the person. So if like warehousing is a great example. You know, right now Amazon seasonally hires hundreds of thousands of people to man warehouses, like around Christmas time and things like that. And these are great seasonal jobs. Many people depend on these jobs. But if you look at the types of warehouses that are being built in China right now, they look nothing like the warehouses we have now. It's not just, you know, forklifts, you know, organized bins and stuff like that where people are going around and sorting things. It's literally just pure robotics on the inside. There's like spiders crawling along the walls and stuff like that.
I think
Completely,
they have a name for this. They call it dark warehouses or something like that.
yeah, dark warehouses, exactly. So it's like, yeah, exactly. They don't need lights. They're robots. You don't even need to pay the lights bill. Thomas Edison would be real sad, you know, the light bulbs going out of business. So that's exactly right. So it's like, you know, you're not expanding the productivity of warehouse workers there. You're just getting rid of them.
So Alex, there must be like some point where if you actually get like agents and robots to be universal substitutes for humans, universal being doing pretty heavy lifting there, right? Universal substitutes for humans, then there is definitely like at that point there's a complete collapse of the labor market. There must be some place where this thing just like tips, because that's one of the things people are just like, if just project 30 years, right, and see, okay, suppose a robot can do like pretty much anything a human does. Now, is there still things that what happens to the labor market in that extreme?
So I'm going to depending on when this airs, I think my essay, my paper and essay will actually be online at that point. So I'm actually writing about that specific scenario. My conjecture is that there's going to be a pretty healthy labor market. It'll probably be smaller than what we have now. It's definitely going to be smaller, but I would argue that it's not going to be that much smaller, and it's not going to be zero. You could look. So here's what happens. You have to think about production, and then you have to think about consumers, right? What happens when you automate something? The goods become a lot cheaper. And so now consumers have more money in their pocket. So people are getting richer on the other side of the equation. So you can look at what happens in the economy and what happens to demand when people get richer. What do they buy? And it turns out they don't buy. The income effect is not that they just buy the same share of every good, just more. They actually switch what they buy. And this is from like a long history from 1850. You can look at the data.
So this is basically the satiating of preferences, something like that, right? That's
Not quite. So there's the possibility of satiation, which is basically means if I'm rich enough, I just don't want anything. This is something different. This means like I do want something more, but what is it? It's going to be different than before. And what people end up wanting more of, you can kind of see this in the behavior of like what billionaires want, is things with human elements in production. So like think of an Armani suit, right? There's different types of Armani suits. There's the types of Armani suits that I get, which are like, you go to the department store, you get it off the rack, you buy it. It's made somewhere, I don't know where it's made. And I don't want to know where it's made, frankly. But rich people, they buy Armani suits too, but they buy a different type of Armani suit. It's called black label. You know exactly how it's made. You know who made it. You know how they made it. It's made by a person. It's made, and essentially, if you look at like the construction of the suit, I'm not a clothing expert. They're pretty similar, right? And if you look at me down this on the street, you'll think you won't be able to tell. But people have a intrinsic preference that isn't sad. That first you need all of your necessities to be satisfied in order for this type of thing to kick in, about goods and services that have some sort of relational quality, that are made by other people, where you can have a relationship with the person who made that thing. You have a relationship with other people who are consuming the same product. And so I call this the relational sector. These are goods where the human element is actually part of the value. And my conjecture is that that's actually going to be a significant sector.
so this actually goes back into the current market itself, like handmade goods,
Exactly.
which are so-called relationship sector, has much higher cost, like much higher sell value than like machine-made goods, right?
Yeah,
Today.
exactly. It's much more expensive. But the thing is, like, it's as far as like satisfying a need, like the hedonics are super similar, right?
It satisfies one other thing. It's a signaling value for suppose.
Exactly,
So
exactly.
that's the thing you get from doing this.
Exactly. This is the relational part. This is the social part of the consumption. And the social part of consumption, when you don't have a lot of money, that's like no part of your consumption. You're just trying to eat, you're just trying to watch TV. But when you have enough money to satisfy all that, most of your money is going to signal.
Right. That's super interesting. I think like, using the current rich people as a kind of like a proxy for where a kind of like a abundance world will look
Exactly.
like, and then like extracting signals from that. That's a really,
Yeah.
really interesting angle.
Yeah. So I think of like the current rich people are going to be, if automation is going to work in the way that we think it will, it's going to make consumers much richer, right? So we can think about like, what are they going to buy? We could just look at current rich people to see. We don't need to come up with science fiction. We could just say like, what are current rich people buying? They're spending a lot of money on relational goods. If there's going to be much more of those people, that sector is going to expand.
So one thing on this is that, like, when we say that the consumers will be much richer, it means that the cost of consumption is going down, but there's an assumption that your wage as a consumer is also static or going up. But it can also go down because the original question was that what if the labor market collapses? Then
Exactly,
you don't
exactly.
have a wage to
All of
even
this, all of this
sustain that.
depends on, all of this depends on speed. If things happen very, very quickly, this sort of nice little story that I'm telling about, like, new jobs being created as old jobs being destroyed and things like that, that doesn't have time to happen. And there could be a collapse. right? If we have time for automation to happen, then you could have time for the people to have money in their pocket by being a part of the relational sector, right? So all of this stuff gets, the movement to the new equilibrium is much more disciplined, and you could have some public policy parts and all of this type of stuff. But if you have a very fast takeoff, all bets are off, then you're in the world where you really need public policy to come in and just like plug the hole. Otherwise, you're gonna get a lot of.
Yeah, super interesting. I think the other possibility or dimension is that, even if the labor market has a temporary kind of collapse before we flip into more complex social relational equilibria, the other thing that can substitute in for it is, more common ownership, like the capital side of the equation being much more distributed, like whether it's through sovereign funds, whether it is through more universal ownership on the set of assets that actually have create this net value, because we're all betting that there is net value created, right? Like it's just the fact, the mechanism by which it's distributed, the ownership of that. I don't know, Alex, if you've done any work on, like, of course, there's the UBI and other thinking, universal basic compute, intelligence, other ideas that are floating around. What's your favorite like angle of approach to this problem?
Yeah, so I wrote about this in the piece called "Can Advanced AI Lead to Negative Economic Growth?" where I kind of like formally explored all these questions. The end of the piece ends with my favorite proposal for assuaging these issues, and it's exactly broad capital ownership. I call it a AI sovereign wealth fund. You could call it other stuff. So David Ator likes UBC, which is Universal Basic Capital. Matt Brug calls it a sovereign wealth fund without the AI part, which is kind of like just everybody holding the S&P. I think there's advantages to being more focused on AI, in that I think now is a really good time to fund it because the capital is relatively cheap given to what it's going to be in the future. It acts as almost like an insurance where, like, if we don't have exploding capital share, then it was cheap. We have the insurance. It's fine. If we do have exploding capital share, then that capital share explodes. Everybody's rich. So to me, a more focused fund makes sense. People would argue that maybe if we're picking buyer winners and losers, maybe the AI part isn't going to explode, but other parts of the economy are going to explode. So there's certainly downsides to a focused fund. My sense is that the argument it's just very, very much more expensive to have an unfocused fund. So just from practical reason, I think a more focused fund makes sense. But generally, I think broad capital ownership just has the economic properties are just so good compared to the other alternatives.
Right. So can you walk through that trade-off a little bit, to systems like UBI versus like more capital ownership, like,
Well,
sovereign?
UBI's universal basic income, basically that means that you get a check from the government every month saying like this is your income. The problem is that you are not a member of the economy. You are now you're a member of the economy in the sense that you're consuming, but you're not producing. You're not holding, you don't have a stake in it. Your only stake is to make sure companies get money for their products. There's a power dimension here that's very, very bad. Every single time a new government gets into power, who knows what's going to happen to your UBI, right? I don't want to live in a world where politicians are elected based on how much handouts they can give to people, frankly, to put it, as bluntly as possible. I don't want to live in that world.
Right.
UBC doesn't have this issue. The capital it's like Social Security, right? There's capital, there's a fixed formula, there's dividends to the capital. It's growing, it's decreasing, you get the dividends, and that's it. Nobody has power over it unless there's a complete collapse of the
But isn't the problem here also the same that a new government comes and they can change where this fund get invested, where this sovereign fund like puts money, like they can change the stocks. Like there is no commitment that the government or
The idea is that there would be a constitution over it, right? So that's why it's a sovereign wealth fund. There's a constitution over the fund. And there's rules, like, for example, people cannot trade their stakes. So you had the example, like, actually Russia tried to do something like this, right? So they when they started privatizing the nationalized companies, they tried to give everybody stocks, but the problem is everybody could trade their stocks. So what happened? A couple people knocked on some doors. Hey, can I have these shares? You don't know what they are. Just give them to me. It's fine. Here's a pair of jeans, right? And that's how the oligarchs formed. So you can't have people trade their shares. You need a constitution over the fund so that any new government can't change how this is invested. This is not like the president's private little portfolio. There's a constitution. It's just a set thing. UBI, and here's the kicker. You are a productive member of the economy by having stake in the economy. You have shares in the economy. You are bearing risk in the economy. So if we think Jamie from Chase Bank is a productive member of the economy, which we all agree that he is, everybody with a stake in UBC would be a similarly productive member of the economy. They are bearing risk, and they're being compensated for bearing that risk.
That's really interesting. In terms of this like diff between like a sovereign fund that is more universal versus AI, one of the ideas we've been toying around with here is that basically you don't know where and like you mentioned, the kind of like the fork in the road is if you do a more general fund, the more focused fund, the issue is what if productivity gains like occur elsewhere. So I think ideally what you want is basically like options against the current S&P price, something like that. Basically like you basically get like, the sovereign funds owns like options that strike at the current price. So no matter which stocks kind of like go up, and likely it's the AI stocks that are going to go up much
Yeah.
more. So it automatically kind of like balances into the
Yeah,
portfolio
you
that.
want some sort of insurance against that. Exactly. I mean, there's going to be like, I think, to be perfectly frank, I think things need to get worse for there to be political capital in order to think about these issues. Like, as all things, we need to be, the thing that motivates policy is disaster. With COVID, we saw huge movement, like much bigger than what we're suggesting in some ways, of policy and fiscal steps being taken to prop up the economy. But it took a disaster, and so my hope is that it's not going to. We'll have like hints of a disaster rather than a disaster in order for these steps to be taken. So it's going to be a lot of hours in a room spent figuring out exactly how to structure it. It's not going to be a simple thing. But I do think UBI would be a disaster.
Right, because it's also like making commitments on things that you don't, if you made it a rigid commitment, the problem is you have an unpredictable future, whether it's actually all these things manifest, what's the time scale at which you manifest, you have liabilities that may like
When
either.
does it kick in? Who gets it? Is it means tested? Is it targeted? Like, is it going to be, are people who become unemployed because of AI? How do you measure the responsibility of AI? All of these crazy things need to be considered. At the end of the day, almost nobody's going to get the money, and then the money's going to run out. So I'm very against UBI.
So one thing we think a lot about in our own project and products here is we have this thesis we call digital intelligence needs digital institutions. The mechanisms to administer these things. I think one of our observations is the technology has asymmetrically benefited like the free individual and the free market, but the technologies of coordination, right, including how somebody would participate in things like a sovereign fund remain like pretty antiquated, right? Like, but we have cell phones, we have AI agents that can represent you, go take actions on your behalf, go vote on your behalf, all these things. And so I think that is a new dimension as society explores new ideas at this frontier. That it's not just that AI is impacting giving more leverage to the free individual, but also our institutions become more updated, upgraded with AI, and credible commitment technology where you can actually like create these commitments.
Yeah, I mean, I think AI first institutions are going to be a huge part of what's going to be happening in the future, including for the types of stuff that we've been talking about. As far as like companies that are going to be adopting AI, there's going to be diffusion through existing companies, but that's going to be slow. There's a bunch of bottlenecks. There's like IT departments with their own agency incentives and things like that. But then there's going to be AI first organizations where AI was the governing factor from the beginning and everything was organized around AI. And as we mentioned before, you're going to have situations like 3-person teams being able to do like, what used to be like 100-person, 500-person company. But that's kind of like one part of institutional development is going to be on the organizational side. But just the other types of institutional development is going to be just like on the basic economics of like agents doing shopping for you. What does that look like? How do agents communicate with one another on the internet? You're going to have questions that we haven't had to deal with before because of, human constraints. But if each human could have as many agents on acting on their behalf as compute would allow them to, then you're going to get it very quickly into issues of congestion on the platform side. So you're going to be running into issues of, platforms experiencing congestion when millions and millions of agents are trying to interact with them at the same time. And these agents are, trying to throw their users' preferences or doing stuff like even more complicated where a person sends multiple agents with different sorts of instructions in order to get the best price, for example, if there's price discrimination going on or something like that. So all of these sorts of things are going to have to be accounted for. And like, what do agents use to transact? Are they just using US dollar digitally, or is there, you guys know better than I do, is there a crypto component to it? Which is, to be honest, I think that's, I see that as kind of inevitable, for there to be some sort of smart contract crypto component of some sort to this type of stuff. And you've had other guests who I think could talk in a much more smart way about these things. But I think there's ways of transactions that are digital first.
Right.
And those will likely be the ones that are.
Right. So, Alex, I saw your article on the tragedy of commons with it seems clear and inevitable that as long as there is more than one agent, that you need markets, you need institutions where like these agents interact, clear rules of the road, and all these agents are digital. So part of the thing that I think as we think about that world, and you've expounded on it in different ways, but one thing that I think is super interesting is when you think of humans had like a fixed number and like a population growth, which was kind of like a underlying kind of like macroeconomic variable, which is very significant in how economies develop, grow, the demographic dividend, all these ideas that go with it. When you look at agents, they have a very different profile of like, their ability to grow, proliferate. And we see this in micro situations already. Like, for example, in open source repositories, there's this ability for anybody to come and contribute and raise a pull request to update a code. And nominally, it is gated by people who understand, code, and they can verify like what the request is. Over the last 3 months, I think like the number of PRs into a repo have exploded because this system of like accepting and reviewing and like updating a PR was human centric. So in a world where agents are equal actors in the economy, and you can think of two different kinds of agents, maybe like agents which are delegated from humans and agents as their own kind of like economic actors, right? So both of them are possible forks. But in either of these, you have this place where the role of agents, and Dario famously has this like country of geniuses in a data center analogy or metaphor. And like, how do you think economic modeling has to upgrade to think of agents as like, materials or like other resources and technology, but also as like actors, like humans in this equation that we normally plug into the economy?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things to unpack there. So there's the difference between like agents acting on behalf of humans versus just agents with their own provenance, and like, so that world is extremely different, right? So the one where agents have their own property rights and they're not owned by anybody, they're just acting on their own behalf and consuming for themselves, and they have property rights. So that this is the question of governance, right? So like, if there's governance where agents have their own property rights and are treated like humans, That's a very different economy. And I don't think I have a lot to say about it, to be honest, because I don't, I think we're so far away from that I haven't really spent a lot of time on it, because you have to think about, like, how do you measure welfare? How do you do like public policy? How do you do public finance with the exponential population growth, and stuff like that? So that's a question that deserves a lot more scrutiny. But I also think we have time. I think the question that we have less time is when there's a lot of agents that are acting on behalf of humans, where each human can have a lot of agents, and there I think you're going to be kind of going through through the question of, like, how do you elicit people's preferences for their agent, right? So how do you align agents to their humans? So one big question is going to be whether this sort of world is welfare improving or welfare decreasing. So you mentioned about these pull requests, right? So let's say we're in a world where we just live in a static world like now, where the scope of technology, the adoption of AI increases, but nothing else changes. Then you're going to get into a world where these digital spaces are going to be completely overwhelmed, right? So that's sort of what you're hinting at, right? And the reason they're going to get overwhelmed, what's different now is that verification used to take less time than production. So me generating code and doing all of this type of stuff,
Right.
where the product looks like something good, took longer than the person sitting on the other side to verify, right? That's the world. And so this naturally disciplined the amount of stuff that gets produced.
Right.
Because I don't want to spend 20 hours in order for you to just say that this is crap, get this out of here. We flipped it now, right? So now an AI agent could create something that looks great. And in order for me to find out that actually this is complete slop, that would take me longer than for the agent to produce it. So how do you solve it? Well, you solve it with AI. You just need, and to me, like, I think a lot of people are panicking about this. I'm personally really just not panicking at all. I think what we're going to end up in the near term, I'm not even talking like 5 years, I'm talking about like 12 months. We're just going to have an agentic layer to almost everything, right? We're going to have an agentic layer at the academic journals. We're going to have an agentic layer on GitHub. We're going to have an agentic layer on X, where we all met and interacted.
Yesterday, the App Store now like does agentic reviews, because of course with vibe coding, there's all kinds of app submissions.
Exactly.
Of course, you have to have an agent to review it. You can't have a human to review it.
But it's like, but the thing is, the exact same technology that allowed the agent to be able to produce the content is exactly the technology that's going to allow the defense to say this is slop, because it's
Yeah.
verifiable.
Yeah.
It's the same.
So one question. So
Yeah.
if you're saying that agents will take the verification role, so verification as a task is not going to be a part of a job, right? Is that what it means? That there will never be a labor market where verification is the requirement as one of the tasks for that job?
There's at least 2 steps to verification. So I'm an academic. So let's say I'm a journal editor. Right now, journal editors are worried about getting like thousands of submissions, hundreds of thousands of submissions, where they are just overwhelmed with the ability to verify. So the journal editor is not going to be fired, in the sense that they will still need to verify, but they will need to verify for like based on taste, and like academic contribution, on like contribution to the literature, like subjective things where there's less verification data to like be able to make that verification decision. The AI layer will just verify, like, is that proof correct? Do the experimental results seem like they were actually run by an experiment? Can I verify the fact, for empirical work, for example, if there's experimental work, likely there's going to be some sort of verification step that the experiment was actually run. This could easily be done by an agent. Is there an IRB from a known university that you could contact to say, look, this was done, this was not done? There's an agent on the IRB side. Like, you know what I mean? Everything is going to be agentic communication, but the verification is still going to be, so the people who used to verify things will still verify things. They will just be there was the tasks. There used to be the task of the verifier to just look at, does this look reasonable? That's going to be gone. But the other task of a job, contribution to the literature, does this address the broader issue that I'm trying to request for?
Or what criteria the agent uses to review this thing? Like what should be the important things that it should pay attention to? Like this, like the meta tasks of verification, along with stripping out the most important tasks of
Mhm.
verification. That's those tasks get like more to the editor and the other tasks.
Exactly. And I mean, sometimes, to be honest, sometimes maybe the human verifier will be completely out of the loop. There, in many cases that might be true. I see it coming less on the academic side because there's just so many subjective elements to the review process. But in other cases, you could have just the agentic layer doing all of the verification.
Right.
So now it means that what will be under this model, what will be the next, like what are these people humans going to so you mentioned that they will be managing capital, so they are doing the work of managing the risk. But the Jamie Dimon example, his job is to be the principal, right, of that capital. Is the only job for humans is to be the principal. Like most humans are not, I don't know whether they will derive meaning from being just a principal of a capital that they are managing. So how do you think this labor market of just being a capital manager is going to work out?
I think there's definitely Alex's relational addition to that, right? So it's not just capital, but what other dimensions maybe exist?
I think, the answer is I don't really know. I think you ask a person in 1940 what jobs will we have in 2026.
And a podcaster will not be one of those jobs, but
Right. So it's like, oh, I bet actually you guys are very secure. This is one of the most secure jobs in the history of jobs. What does Elon Musk want to do all day? He wants to be on podcasts.
So
So
this is
you
the
guys,
human
you
relationship.
guys did it. You guys did it. You guys found the future-proof job. San Francisco is just going to be tables of podcasts on every single street. So don't worry. The company might be gone, but the podcast will be there. The answer is like I think it's almost silly to like imagine future jobs because it's like we just the only I can tell you about like the contours of the thing, but like the actual shape of the thing, we need to get closer to it.
one thread I wanted to pick up on, Alex, that you mentioned, like, the fork in the road of like, agents acting as delegates of humans versus agents like, their own actors. We have a thesis at Eigen. It's somewhere in the middle. They say agents will be the new companies, right? So we have an already existing definition of an actor which can hold property and take actions and scaffold liabilities and all these things, and that's the nature of a company, right? As like an actor that can own property, do all these things. And if you went back like 250 years and said like companies are going to hold more wealth than most countries, that would sound like a crazy claim. Yet here we are, right? Like, public companies already hold like more than $100 trillion. So like a bet that it's a product bet, but like a bet on the future is that as you have agents which can be like have their own property and so on, they'll become the new form of companies where like an agent is at the center. It can own its property. It can the capital and the governance are all digital, programmable, and then you scaffold all of these things and then say like maybe legally it's represented just like a standard company, but basically its operations are purely digital and like it can actually do all these things.
So part of that is like completely possible. I don't think there's anything where I would disagree with that characterization of a future company. I think the key part is still, at the end of the day, these companies are owned by humans, by shareholders. So there's no such thing as like a company as like a thing that's separate from people that own something. It's the
Right,
shareholders who own the
right.
company. So you could have agents like doing all of these things. But at the end of the day, the question will still be, are there human shareholders or are you cutting that? And that's where that step is where all of everything lives, right? If there are no shareholders, you're in a completely different
Right.
world.
Weird and different world, and like you're
Clarion
like,
jihad will be declared in that sort of world, is my guess. That's
that's
really the
great.
key. The key is you have to go back into you have to talk about the law, and as long as there is the ultimate owners, we're talking about property rights. If they're still human, then we are in a world where regular economics can somewhat operate. If we're in a world where there are no humans in the ownership structure, then I think
So, like a version of the question would be like where companies were bounded in like the number of companies. So, I asked earlier, like as the number of humans, how as an input into this like economy, like a version that I think would be like interesting to think about is when the frictions to create companies go down to just like software and agents kind of like figuring out every gap in the economy and just like going and doing it and just like solving it, like what dynamics might that give rise to might be an interesting kind of
so.
question.
The main question, and I should have started with this, because this is the only question in economics about post AGI economics. Really, the only question: what is scarce? That's the only question. Once you answer that question, everything else is easy in some ways. If you're thinking about the labor market, what's scarce, right? Is it provenance? Is it relational capital? Is that what becomes scarce? Okay, let's work out the labor market model. In a world with like exploding companies, the thing that's going to be scarce is like human attention, human ability to desire a bundle of goods. Like if I have, a menu of 1,000,000 goods, am I considering 1,000,000 goods? No, I'm still considering like 5 or 6. I still have bounded cognition. So if that's the case, then that's going to be the natural constraint to the proliferation of companies. This is why I said if agents have ownership of themselves, then it's a completely different economy. I have no idea what's scarce then. Probably compute, and that's the only thing. But if we're still in a world with human ownership, we could figure out what's scarce, and then based on how we figure out what's scarce, we're going to get the answer to what the economy would look like. So I think every question about the future of the economy just needs to start with what is scarce.
Yeah. Okay. That's a really good phrasing. When intelligence becomes abundant, what sets of things are scarce? And I think you point out, like in labor market, maybe things like provenance, relational, social, those things become scarce. In terms of consumption, things like human needs, desire, attention, these become scarce. So you just go to like what remains static in this world, and then you can kind of know the boundaries and contours. Fascinating. One other like related thing, because you mentioned it seems like the line that you're drawing is agents are actually agents in the game theoretic principal agent setting, as opposed to agents are principals. I think that seems to be like because as long as like agents are just agents, right? And AI agents are just like delegates of human agency, then you get a certain world where we can reason through all these things. And if agents are principals, then you get a different world. One of the things we've been thinking a lot about at Eigen is actually humans as agents in the game theoretic setting. Actually, agents as agents actually are much better than humans as agents. You can think of this at the level of governance. You can think of this at the level of a company. You can think of this as a level of like just individual delegation, right? Because when in AI, for example, one of the most important problems is the alignment problem, right? Like how do you get an AI to align to like what you want? But the alignment problem is a fundamental problem in game theory. Like, how do you align a company to like its shareholders? How do you align like a president to the constitution? How do you align like a government to its like eventual source of power, which is the democracy? But one of our realization is if you can actually take an agent, give it constraints, constitution inputs, and run it in a verifiable manner, then AI agents, are actually like much better as agents of human delegation than the alternative systems that we have, because they can be programmatically constrained, they can be programmatically verified. You know that they haven't taken any other bribe or like acting out of any other secondary interest. This is the training data, this is how they're trained, this is how they need to execute. You can specify these contours much tighter. So that's one of the theses that like we've been building towards, and building a lot of tools around, for example, or if I run, like imagine an agent is acting on our behalf, then is the agent executing with the prompt that I specified? Is it executing with the model that I specified? Is the upgrade of the agents governed in the with the contracts that I've already specified, and so on? So those are the things that, like the tech Legos that we're building towards this future. But this picture of agents, AI agents as better in the principal agent relationship, how does that land with the mental models that you have in this?
I can verify, I can do a lot more experimentation. Like if I have a particular task, all of the agents, if they're based on the same underlying model, they'll perform in this context very similarly. Whereas I don't have as much ability to do that with people. So experimentation is a lot easier because you can just scale. But on the other hand, what's more difficult is that I don't know what their objective function is because they were trained using a large corpus of data. So LLMs are much more, in some ways, much more context sensitive than humans. And you can't really predict, unless you've tested it explicitly, you can't really predict how they're going to be affected by a context. So like there's a DeepMind paper that recently came out about like various ways that you can get into these agentic traps, like prompt injection. You guys, I'm sure everybody's heard about prompt injections, but there's all other sorts of ways that you can manipulate agents. Whereas humans won't be able to be manipulated in this way. And the difference is really, the advantage is experimentation. The disadvantage is you don't have a mental map of the agent. Whereas if I'm talking to you and you're not my agent, you'll never be my agent. But I have people who are my agents, who I work with, my employees. I have a pretty good idea of what they like and don't like. I know that they like more money than less, right? I'm from Eastern Europe. There's a nice Eastern European saying, it's better to be rich and healthy than poor and sick. We could all agree with that. I don't know how to map that to an agent, really, right? I have no idea. They're just, so that's the unpredictability is like the fact that you let them leave the sandbox, and unless that situation looks similar to your sandbox, you're losing some power versus a person where you generally know if you're like paying them enough, generally have some like robustness, a robust mental model of their context, it's going to be okay. This is the part about jagged intelligence, right? The jaggedness is still a problem. And it's going to be a problem for a long time. Now, the valleys are, getting filled up, but it's still jagged. I think everybody agrees it's still jagged. And that's what gives you less robustness than with human agents. So better is yes and no.
Awesome. Super interesting.
So one last question regarding this jagged internet is LLMs good enough to model the whole economy and just come out with the right policies to be made in it? This goes back into Hayek's paper, right? Which is user. No, you don't think so?
No, absolutely. Let me show you a book I have. I have it close by because I think it's an important book to read. It's called Cybernetic Revolutionaries. This is the Allende. In Chile, they tried to program the entire economy. They did in the Soviet Union too, to make the entire thing being a command economy.
Right. Centralized planning, right? Yeah.
And people are, the Marxists are really excited about AI. Some of them are not, because because they're worried about silly things. But a lot of Marxists, the smart ones, they're like, holy shit, we can do command economy now. You can't do command economy. You still can't do command economy for many reasons that will take a whole podcast to figure out. You can do a command economy if you remove all rights from people and give them to the agents. And if all you care about is the welfare of the AI, then you can do a command economy. I'm not endorsing that policy, and I don't think you are either.
This flew by like a little too fast for me. Soubhik, you said something about Hayek, and then Alex just said no like 4 or 5 times. What were you going to say? Are you saying like this is like that's what he's answering?
Can AI be used to operate a command economy? Every podcast about AI will go back to Marx at some point.
Right.
You still can't do it. Hayek's point is that markets give a sufficient statistic that aggregates private information into a public signal. And markets are, in some ways, at that point, were seen as uniquely efficient for that. And the argument is that we don't need Hayek anymore. We could just elicit people's preferences using AI, aggregate them, and then run a command economy. We could tell, we have the demand curves. We figure out the supply curves. We tell each factory what to do. The problem with that is that people will adjust to it, and you will get into something called the Lucas critique, where people will adjust their behavior because now they can strategically lie to the agents, do stuff like that.
I see. So
Anyway,
once you set up a metric, people game the system. That's what basically that's
exactly. And the market is just, if you think about it, it really is magic.
So the one quote we really liked and used before is, before artificial superintelligence using AI, markets are the OG of artificial superintelligence because they know things that no individual knows. And it's because they're aggregating information at this like insane scale and doing this. And one of the principles that we try to use is put markets at the center rather than agents at the center.
Mm-hmm.
And like the idea being agents should be like acting at the edge and the markets should be acting at the center because they resolve these coordination tensions, they resolve those private information things which can all lie at the edge. Different architectures of using agents, like for example a communist whatever organization might say like, here is the agent, this is the country agent, it's going to decide everything. Then now you just put it at the center, as opposed to the other way, like a democratic market-based might be like, if people express their preferences, they're aggregated using this democracy, and as well as people have property rights and everything, and then like you actually express that with you may have agents at the edge to do it. So it's definitely a principle we think about. I don't think Soubhik's advocating to put the agent at the edge.
Nobody here's advocating for a command economy, right?
So, Alex, one question. Given that there is the question of how people are getting advantage of using LLMs for their personal work and a lot of other works, but the dissipation of this technology has not been really uniform yet. There's a huge section of people who have not been able to benefit from it, and because of that reason, there might be reasons that why people are against AI. They have negative opinions of AI. Today, there was some Quinnipiac University poll where it shows that a vast amount of Americans are against AI. I'm sure that outside America, it's the same, probably the similar kind of pattern might be there. So now that means that if we want to turn the public to have positive opinion of AI, they should be able to avail the benefits of AI, which because of pricing controls, how the quality of the inferences are getting degraded due to shortages and all these things, they might not be getting the best benefits. So do you think a government intervention here is the right way to ensure that public has a uniform availability of this the benefits of AI, or do you think that capital free market can still work it out, but slowly, gradually?
Yeah, I would not be for a government intervention here. I just think like I have a pretty high bar for stuff like that. I think we should generally have a high bar for stuff like that. I think this is something that the platforms need to work out for themselves. I think this is what you're describing is a huge problem. It's a very big problem. I think it's going to generate a lot of inequality that, in some ways we could see much more inequality than we used to have, and not through this like sort of capital accumulation channel, but just through like the fact that more productive people are using AI better and then just getting more money through wages and just the regular sort of channels that we're familiar with. But that doesn't meet the bar for public intervention for me. I think like the platforms need to be aware of the fact that, look, if I'm going to be talking about the risks of AI constantly, then I think that has merit. You need to talk about the risks of AI, but you also need to be selling the public on the benefits and the sort of rollout where like the best models where you really see the benefits are only available to people who are already rich and productive. That's going to skew things quite a bit. And I'm not blaming anybody. I don't think there's any blame to go around here. It's just how the market has evolved. When people get a worse model, they have a bad experience, and then they say AI is terrible and look at all the damage it's causing, then you're going to get into issues, but I don't think the government needs to. That's not the scope of the government.
I think things like the universal basic capital that Alex already outlined might actually help in turning the sentiment more favorable, because once you have like economic participants who are aligned with the general proliferation of this technology, they are like less worried about some runoff growth
Well,
that they're.
it's completely aligned, actually. They want, because they'll have more.
Then it seems it's very like time urgent for at least policymakers to think about that, right? Universal basic capital.
But also from the companies should think about
Right, right.
that. The political
Can
economy.
you highlight that possibility? How do companies think about it?
I'm not at a company, so I don't really know how they're thinking about it. I mean, I know they're thinking about.
Not how they should be thinking about it.
No, I don't even know how they are thinking about it. I know just from like the public signals, OpenAI funded that entire UBI study. The best UBI study we have right now is funded by OpenAI. So they spent millions of dollars on it, and we learned a lot from it. And so I think they're thinking about it, and that's Anthropic's on record thinking about these issues. So they're thinking about it. I think there's a very direct role they can play if the conversation turns towards capital, in the sense that they could actually negotiate an agreement where some of the shares are held by the public. That's a very direct measure they can take. Now, what is going on behind closed doors, I have absolutely no idea.
It seems like there is one more last thing is, for example, US government took a 10% stake in Intel, for example. So it could be the similar policy, but enable it for a lot of AI companies.
Exactly.
That will be the UBC here.
Look, this is completely not unprecedented. There's so much precedent for this. We have one in Alaska, right? We already have a sovereign wealth fund in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
the Alaska Permanent Fund. There's sovereign wealth funds all over Europe. The United Arab Emirates has a wealth fund. Norway has a wealth fund. Social Security, there was a big conversation about privatizing Social Security in the mid 2000s. It's kind of faded off, but the argument that came very close to actually happening. It's the exact same process. And so this is not like a pie in the sky sort of idea that there's no precedent for. There's tons of precedent for it.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex, for coming to the show. Just for our listeners, recapping. So today we talked about what labor growth, market, and government role will be in the AGI world, and how it's playing it out in the real time. So really appreciate Alex for coming to the show, talking everything around these topics. Sreeram, do you want to have some closing thoughts?
No, yeah, I really appreciate Alex showing up, talking about these ideas. I think one of the things, models to take away is this question that Alex alluded to, which is think about what is going to remain scarce in the post AGI world. Use that as the contour to back propagate to like what inferences we can make about it. I think we learned a few specific inferences that Alex has already kind of like come to, but I think it leaves us with quite a bit of fodder for thinking. Thanks so much, Alex.
Thank you.